Years ago, there was over 10 farms here on this mountain. Now there's barely 5, probably going to be 4 within a couple years. And as another 20 years goes by, there's going to be less and less.
In the heat of California's Central Valley, the midday sun turns endless rows of ripe, red tomatoes into a heartbreaking sight. The fruit glistens under a thin layer of dust, untouched. There are no workers in the fields, no trucks pulling in to load the harvest, just silence and the slow, inevitable ripening that will end in rot. At a packing facility in Florida, the air smells sharp and sour. Conveyor belts sit still, boxes half-filled, while forklifts idle in the corner. Farmers stand with arms crossed, staring at produce that once sold for top dollar in European markets. Now, it's worth nothing to those buyers. The reason is not blight, not contamination. Not because the product is bad, but because the market has moved on. In February 2025, the United States imposed a 50% export tariff on fresh tomatoes. Officials claimed it would protect domestic prices and level the playing field. But Europe saw it differently. Within weeks, EU buyers shifted to tariff-free partners Mexico and Canada, whose greenhouse-grown crops could meet year-round demand without the price shock. By July, U.S. tomato exports to the EU had fallen 70%. Mexico gained $1.2 billion in new contracts. Canada added another $800 million. Together, they seized a $2 billion market the U.S. once dominated. In Ontario and Sinaloa, high-tech greenhouses are running at full tilt. Workers in clean uniforms move along harvesting lines, packing pristine fruit destined for Paris, Rome, and Berlin. In Texas border towns, the only movement is in the unemployment lines. How did America go from trusted supplier to market outsider in less than half a year? And how did its closest neighbors position themselves to take everything? This is the story of how the United States went from market leader to being left behind, and how Mexico and Canada took it all. For decades, the United States was the heavyweight in North America's tomato trade. From the sun-drenched fields of California, Florida, and Texas, truckloads of fresh, vine-ripened tomatoes made their way to domestic supermarkets and foreign buyers. The U.S. had the acreage, the volume, and the logistical muscle to feed both its own population and lucrative export markets overseas. The European Union was one of the most dependable customers. Seasonal shipments of U.S. tomatoes filled gaps in European production, especially in winter months when local greenhouses couldn't meet demand. Florida's early harvests and California's year-round production cycles meant that American tomatoes had a consistent presence on European shelves. The packaging proudly declared "Product of USA," a mark that once implied reliability. Buyers knew what they were getting: steady volumes, competitive prices, and a reputation for meeting tight deadlines. American produce companies built relationships that spanned decades, sometimes working with the same distributors for a generation. But in the years leading up to 2025, the cracks began to show. Weather disruptions caused irregular harvests. Labor shortages meant some crops were left unpicked. Cold chain delays occasionally reduced shelf life by days, sometimes forcing buyers to sell at a loss. Competitors like Mexico and Canada were modernizing their greenhouse operations, delivering uniform quality at any time of year. Still, the U.S. held its ground until the 50% export tariff in February. That single policy decision became the tipping point. Buyers who had tolerated the occasional hiccup now had a financial reason to walk away. By April, contracts that once renewed automatically were gone. By July, European supermarket labels that had long read USA were replaced with Mexico or Canada. The U.S. didn't just lose sales, it lost trust. The collapse of U.S. tomato exports to the EU in 2025 can be traced to one primary cause: the 50% export tariff and a chain of secondary factors that magnified its impact until recovery seemed impossible. The main blow came in February 2025 when the tariff was announced. Officials framed it as a protective shield for domestic farmers, arguing that imports and low export prices were undermining U.S. growers' profitability. But this wasn't a tax on incoming tomatoes, it was a levy on what left American shores. In effect, it raised the price of U.S. tomatoes for every foreign buyer overnight. For EU importers operating on tight retail margins, that was a deal-breaker. Trade policy made the exit door even wider. The European Union already had tariff-free agreements with both Mexico via the EU-Mexico Global Agreement and Canada through the CETA trade pact. This meant European buyers could switch suppliers instantly without paying extra duties. The price gap between U.S. and competitor tomatoes widened to the point where American shipments were no longer viable. The shift happened fast. By April, EU procurement offices had restructured their sourcing, locking in long-term deals with Mexican and Canadian exporters. By July, the first of these shipments labeled Canadian Fresh and Product of Mexico were stacked high in Rotterdam, Antwerp, and Hamburg. Secondary causes made the U.S. position even weaker. Logistics delays plagued shipments, leaving American ports, with customs backlogs and rising fuel costs adding days to delivery times. Every extra day in transit shaved shelf life from a product that was already perishable. Labor shortages in the U.S. deepened the crisis. Without enough seasonal workers, some growers couldn't harvest on schedule, leaving ripe tomatoes in the fields. Those that were picked often went through outdated grading and sorting systems, producing inconsistent sizes and colors that failed to meet increasingly strict EU retail standards. Meanwhile, Mexico and Canada were positioned for the win. Year-round greenhouse output in Sinaloa and Ontario meant consistent supply no matter the season. Faster customs clearance and integrated NAFTA, CUSMA supply chains allowed them to move product to EU ports faster and fresher. Their quality control systems ensured every shipment was uniform, meeting the EU's retail-grade requirements without exception. The contrast was stark. While U.S. growers were fighting their own system tariffs, slow ports, rising costs, their competitors were working with their governments to streamline exports. One Mexican cooperative CEO described it bluntly: "We didn't win because they lost. We won because we were ready when they stumbled." The result was devastating. By mid-year, U.S. tomato exports to the EU had fallen 70%, representing hundreds of millions in lost sales each month. For some American exporters, the blow was final contracts that took decades to build were gone in weeks, and their former buyers had little incentive to come back. The stage was now set for the winners Mexico and Canada to solidify their grip on the market, and they wasted no time doing exactly that. When the United States stepped back, Mexico and Canada didn't just step in, they ran with the opportunity. The speed and precision with which they filled the EU's fresh tomato demand was the result of years of preparation, strategic investment, and trade diplomacy. In Mexico, the heart of this surge was in Sinaloa and Baja California, regions already known for their advanced greenhouse operations. These facilities aren't rows of plastic tunnels in open fields. They are climate-controlled, computer-monitored environments capable of producing identical, retail-grade tomatoes 365 days a year. LED lighting mimics optimal sunlight, while drip irrigation conserves water and delivers nutrients with scientific precision. Within days of the U.S. tariff announcement, Mexican exporters were negotiating directly with EU procurement officials, offering steady volumes at predictable prices and, crucially, free from any new duties under the EU-Mexico Global Agreement. By April, the first major deal was signed, a $1.2 billion contract to supply vine-ripened, cherry, and grape varieties to European supermarket chains. Mexican shipments began landing in Rotterdam and Valencia within 3 months, meeting strict EU grading standards without a single rejected load. Buyers quickly realized they weren't just getting a cheaper product, they were getting a more reliable one. Canada's rise came through a different but equally powerful route. Leveraging CETA's zero-tariff access to the EU, Canadian growers in Ontario and British Columbia ramped up production in their own high-tech greenhouse clusters. These operations already had experience meeting, demanding European quality specifications for other produce like peppers and cucumbers, so adding tomatoes at scale was a seamless transition. Seasonal workers were recruited from across Canada and abroad, packing lines were expanded, and cold chain logistics were tightened to guarantee that tomatoes left the greenhouse and arrived in Europe in perfect condition. The result was a wave of new contracts worth $800 million annually. EU retailers, always cautious about supplier risk, took note of Canada's political and economic stability. In an era where reliability is as important as price, this was a major selling point. Both countries benefited from their position within NAFTA, CUSMA supply chains, which gave them access to advanced packaging technology and transport networks that were already integrated with U.S. systems but now redirected to serve Europe. And both worked closely with government trade offices to expedite contracts and clear any regulatory hurdles before they could slow shipments. While U.S. exporters were fighting tariffs and port delays, Mexico and Canada were cutting ribbons on expanded facilities, hiring more workers, and announcing record-breaking shipment volumes. EU buyers, once split across multiple suppliers, began consolidating their orders to these two countries, locking in multi-year agreements that would be difficult and costly to unwind. By the end of the summer shipping season, the message was clear. Mexico and Canada weren't just temporary replacements. They were the new pillars of the EU's fresh tomato supply. And as they scaled up, the economic shock on the US side was only beginning to deepen. Across the United States tomato belt, from the greenhouses of California's Central Valley to the open fields of Florida and Texas, the signs of contraction are everywhere. Packing plants that once ran 2 or 3 shifts a day now operate at half capacity or have shut down entirely. Rows of idle machinery sit behind chain-link fences, their paint fading under the sun. In Florida, grower Linda Martinez stands in an empty processing shed. Just months ago, this building bustled with dozens of workers washing, sorting, and boxing tomatoes for overseas buyers. Now the space echoes with her footsteps. "We didn't lose these customers because our tomatoes suddenly turned bad," she says. "We lost them because the rules changed overnight and we weren't ready." The economic shock has been brutal. An estimated tens of thousands of jobs tied to tomato production, processing, and logistics have been lost or cut back since February. Trucking companies that specialized in refrigerated produce runs to East Coast ports are parking trailers in dusty lots. Rural equipment suppliers report plunging sales as farmers delay or cancel orders for new harvesters and grading machines. The social effects are just as stark. In Texas border towns, some farm families are selling off parcels of land that have been in their name for generations, unable to make loan payments without steady export income. Young workers, faced with fewer hours and lower wages, are leaving agricultural communities for urban jobs, draining towns of both their labor force and their future. Even in greenhouses that are still producing, there's a noticeable shift in mood. Growers who once spoke confidently about the next season now talk about if they'll plant at the same scale. The EU market was not just a revenue stream, it was a stabilizer that balanced seasonal volatility in domestic sales. Without it, the US tomato industry feels exposed, vulnerable to every swing in weather, fuel prices, and domestic demand. The loss is not only financial, it's reputational. Buyers who once considered the US a cornerstone supplier now see it as unpredictable. And in global trade, that perception can take years, even decades, to reverse. The question now isn't just whether American growers can win back their lost contracts, it's whether they can rebuild the trust that was broken in less than 6 months. In international produce markets, trust is currency. For decades, the United States traded on the assumption that if a buyer signed a contract, the shipment would arrive on time, in full, and in perfect condition. That trust is what kept buyers coming back, even when prices fluctuated or weather caused short-term dips in quality. But the events of 2025 fractured that relationship. The 50% export tariff didn't just make US tomatoes more expensive, it signaled to foreign buyers that policy shifts in Washington could upend their supply chains without warning. For the EU, which operates on long planning cycles for retail distribution, unpredictability is a deal-breaker. Mexico and Canada, by contrast, offered something more valuable than a temporary price advantage: stability. Mexico's supply was anchored by the EU-Mexico Global Agreement, which ensured zero tariffs and transparent trade terms. Canada leveraged CETA, giving European buyers a direct pipeline to greenhouse-grown produce without fear of sudden duty hikes. Both countries maintained year-round availability through controlled environment agriculture, meaning no gaps in delivery schedules. Buyers also value communication. Several EU importers noted that Mexican and Canadian exporters provided proactive updates on shipping times, quality reports, and even weather-related risks. This created a sense of partnership rather than mere transaction. One EU retail buyer put it plainly, "We can't afford to gamble on a supplier that might change the rules mid-contract. Price matters, but reliability wins." This is the hard truth for US growers in global trade. Losing on trust is harder to recover from than losing on price. Contracts can be renegotiated, tariffs can be repealed. But once buyers believe you're unpredictable, they start designing you out of their long-term plans. For the United States, reclaiming its place in the EU market will require more than competitive prices. It will require proving, over years, that the product will always arrive exactly as promised. In the span of just 6 months, the United States watched a cornerstone of its agricultural export market collapse. What began as a 50% export tariff intended to protect growers instead pushed the European Union into the arms of 2 ready, willing, and capable suppliers, Mexico and Canada. Together, they seized a $2 billion market, locked in multi-year contracts, and strengthened their reputations as dependable partners. The lesson is clear. In global trade, growing a great crop is only half the job. The other half is delivering it in perfect condition, on time, every time, and doing so under stable, predictable trade terms. Reliability is not built in a season, it's built over decades. But it can be lost in a single policy decision. If the US wants to win this market back, it must address the root causes of its decline: unstable trade policies, outdated infrastructure, and inconsistent supply. Without change, the rejection of 2025 will not be a one-time event, it will be the new normal. So the question for farmers, policymakers, and trade negotiators is this: can the United States rebuild the trust it has lost? Or has the EU tomato market slipped away for good, leaving its future firmly in the hands of Mexico and Canada? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to be first to know when the next major market shift happens, subscribe now and join us for the next chapter.